Hello, everyone. Today we are continuing with Chapter 16, and the focus of today's lecture is couples and family therapy. This is the second half of Chapter 16. So, a few things to note about family and couples therapy is that there's going to be some similarities to group therapy because you're often going to have more than one client at a time. Um, But it's different too, because with a group, these people don't know each other typically. Versus with a family, obviously there's strong connections, history. So it's going to be slightly modified than just a regular group therapy. So a few things to know is that who becomes the client can be different. Sometimes the whole family is considered the client. So the whole nuclear family, whoever is living together. Sometimes it can even include the extended family, or it might just be a subset of the family, depending on the particular issues that are coming up. So who becomes the quote unquote client isn't just one person, but it's oftentimes the whole unit or part of the unit of the family. And family therapy is often suggested or done when some issue is happening in the family and that the whole family needs to tackle this problem in order for changes to be made. So it could be that there's one child who's having an issue in school, doing their homework. And even though the child is the one maybe having the primary issue, but there's likely things in the family that are contributing to this issue. And so this is why family therapy is done, is when it's not just one individual that needs to change, but the whole system. So this first video, I'm going to talk about two primary family theories. The first is family systems theory, which was created originally by Murray Bowen. Sometimes this is called Bowenian theory after his name. And then we'll talk about structural family therapy, which sort of took Bowenian theory and added on to it a little bit. So Murray Bowen was an American psychiatrist and really starting in the 50s and 60s started developing the theories related to families and that families have these unique connections and influences on each other that impact individuals. And he believes that there are two opposing forces that individuals have regarding their family. On the one hand, there's a force that's pushing people towards their family. He believed that people have a drive for togetherness, that people want to be connected, that we're social beings and we want to sort of be near or be connected to family. And yet, on the other hand, we have this force that's pushing us to separate from our family, that we have this drive towards individuality and autonomy and uniqueness that we're trying to sort of get away from our family. So these two forces are in conflict. They're sort of opposing each other, that we can be both drawn towards our family and want to be separate from our family. And this creates some issues in family and in individuals. Bowen believed that families can pass down unhealthy patterns through generations, that the way that parents model things, impact the children, and this can be a multi-generational transmission process. The therapist, when treating families, needs to sort of stay a bit outside. They shouldn't be drawn into the family system, or else they can be, sort of caught in the middle of these conflicts. So this theory was developed, as I mentioned, in the US, and it's a little bit unknown if this type of theory would work in other cultures that are more collectivistic. that maybe don't have as strong of a push towards the individuality. A few other things to note is that within this theory, family systems theory, there is a term called the quote unquote identified patient. And it's called this way, like an identified patient, is because usually someone comes in and says, my child is having a problem, or my husband is the problem, um, for example. So usually the family has picked someone as quote unquote the person with the problem. And often family usually ignore the role that they're playing in maintaining or creating this problem. They're usually oblivious to the ways that they are maybe enabling this person or contributing to this person's behaviors. And so it can be hard in the beginning to get the family on board that they might need to be also doing some changes to get the identified patient to change. So again, just remember that the identified patient is usually one who comes in with the problem, but usually from this perspective, the whole family needs to address this issue. I'm going to be posting this video. It sort of summarizes some of Bowenian theory. I'll also do that in the next slides, but this is sort of a nice summary of some of Bowenian concepts. So I'll be posting this along with my regular video. So we're going to be talking about what are some primary concepts from this theory. The first concept is that systems are organized as a whole. So a family system is sort of in place as the whole system. We have this idea and this concept of a family that operates um, as a whole. However, there's obviously different parts to this. There's, let's say, the parents or the children or the step parents or the stepchildren. And so all the various elements are interdependent, meaning that they affect one another. One person's actions are going to impact another person's actions. And so there's this idea that the behavior of each member or partner, if it's a couple, is dependent on the other. And these people develop interactional patterns over time that people sort of get into certain roles and develop different behavior patterns. Because of this interdependence, there's something called circular causality, meaning that different elements, so A and B, mutually influence each other. So person A influences person B, B influences person A. It's not just usually one directional cause, but it's circular. So if we take this as an example, let's say Stan and his boss are stuck in a pattern that mutually reinforces each other negatively. So this isn't a family, but it's the same idea. So let's start here. Stan gets nervous and feels intimidated by his boss. Maybe he's just more naturally nervous and his boss is somewhat intimidating. So then Stan makes mistakes when his boss is watching him because he's nervous um, and his boss is intimidating. So he starts making mistakes. Then Stan's boss gets concerned about Stan's job performance because he was watching him and speaks to Stan about his mistakes, which then makes Stan more nervous and more intimidated. And so this is just showing how one behavior is often influenced by another person and then becomes circular and growing off of each other. So that can be a little bit hard when a family has patterns and they've been doing these patterns for years and years and they've been mutually influencing each other for years and years because they're both reinforcing each other. On the flip side of this is a concept called equifinality. And this is that because of circular causality, we can actually intervene at any of those moments during any part of that cycle. And if we change one part of the system, it's going to impact another part of the system. So this is sort of the hopeful side, is that um, it might feel a bit stressful knowing that all these factors are influencing each other. But the good news is that because it's a system, if we change one part, it's going to impact the other parts. So this can actually be quite hopeful, is that we need to impact and change things um, at multiple levels, but there's usually ripple effects. On the flip side of those ripple effects is that these systems are fairly resistant to change. They like homeostasis. They like the operating the way it is. They've been operating this way for years. It's very entrenched into people's behavior patterns, thought patterns, and so on. And so change can be really hard, because even if one person tries to change, the rest of the family may sort of put them back into their spot. They may say, what is this person doing? This is weird. I want them to act like how they normally do. And so the system as a whole prefers homeostasis. Um, and I saw this happen in when I was doing alcohol and drug treatment, that as soon as one person started changing, let's say the alcoholic stopped drinking or reduced their drinking, this caused, you would think that this would be happy, and people generally were happy, but then they didn't know how to relate to them, because they were used to this dynamic of them fighting, and dynamic of them getting into trouble with the law or something else. So it sort of shifts things, and people don't know how to react to that. And so it sometimes then gets pushed back to the way things were and pushed back into homeostasis. So that's what we mean by homeostasis. It's a biological term, but basically in this sense, it's that we prefer um, things to stay the way they are. Another concept of systems theory is that not only is the family unit as a whole a system, but there starts being subsystems, and things sort of get broken down with alliances and allegiances. And so you can think about how, even if there's a family, there might be subsystems. So maybe the children subsystem and the parental subsystem. Those are two subsystems that work together. The children might collaborate and try to make their parents mad. The parents might collaborate to discipline the children. And so these subsystems are working together in the system. And these are due to hierarchies, who has power. Um, Oftentimes parents, have more power. They're adults. They're the ones making money, bringing in food. But other subsystems can develop too by gender. So maybe the women are getting up on the men, and so on. So there's lots of different subsystems that can develop in coalitions. And sometimes this can result in what we call triangles, where you've probably heard of like love triangles, romantic triangles, where this is often a trope in movies. There's one person and she's sort of split between her two interests. Triangles happen a lot in families too, not love triangles, but sort of pitting two people against each other, to deflect from something else, a third person. And triangles will happen more and more, and we'll talk a little bit about that in the next slide. The final concept that I'll cover, just basic concept of systems theory, is that people in these systems have boundaries. And these boundaries can look different. So some people have very rigid boundaries, and we call this like a detached relationship. So perhaps this is the mother in the red circle here and the son over here. And they overlap a little bit, but they really don't know much about each other's lives. They're not emotionally close with each other. They're sort of very, very detached. And this can be difficult for many reasons, but they're not really able to support each other. They don't really know each other. This can create feelings of isolation, loneliness in families. So if one family has too rigid boundaries, there can be this detachment. And Bowen developed this idea of rigid boundaries, and then the opposite is diffuse boundaries, where people become enmeshed. So they are becoming so overlapped, they don't even know who they are individually. Um, Again, maybe like the mother and daughter are so enmeshed that they share everything with each other, share all of their deepest, darkest secrets, and so on. And so in enmeshed relationships, it's hard to differentiate between mother and daughter, or let's say the parents, they're so enmeshed that they don't ever do anything on their own. They just sort of become one. And this can be problematic too. If something needs to change, if someone needs to leave for college, if someone, breaks up with the other person, this can cause really difficulties with enmeshment. So a more healthy um, boundaries are in the middle, where you have some independence and you have some moments of engagement. So there should be some overlap between the two people in a relationship, but not completely overlapped and not completely detached. So Bowen developed these ideas about healthy boundaries, and these lead to different patterns and rules, usually unspoken rules in families, about who can be close, who can't be close, who tells people what. There's lots of unspoken rules and patterns that develop within families. All right, so a few more concepts related to family systems therapy. Bowen believed that we need to resolve conflictual attachments to our families. So when we have conflicts, again, he believed that we would pass these on to our new families as we get married and so on. And so that we really need to work through these conflictual attachments. And a few of the things that were already mentioned that I want to go into a little more depth on are triangulation and differentiation. So, triangulation, again, is when two people sort of end up creating a triangle with a third person. And usually, this is done to relieve any sort of difficulties that are happening between the two people. So, here's an example. Again, this is a husband, a wife, and a child. Again, triangulation happens when a third person, or it can even be other things like the TV or whatever, that deflect from the issues between the two people. So let's say husband and wife are having some issues. They are fighting a lot. They aren't getting along. They're disagreeing over money, things like that. And so they have a child. And this child ends up being a way to deflect from their difficulties, because they can focus all their attention onto the child. Maybe the husband now works and says, it's because I want to provide from the child. And the wife now is at home more because they're wanting to provide from the child. So this gets them away from focusing on their issues that they're having between the two of them. And they're using that third person as a way to deflect from that issue. It relieves the stress of the original relationship. And how this might affect the child is, let's say now the mom and the child are really close, and the child becomes fused with the mom. And so now there's conflict between the child and the dad. So it sort of transferred this block to the child. So it can just really affect all of the relationships. The third person could be a like an adultery, like a situation where someone's cheating on their other person. So it could be, let's use the husband and wife example, and then the third person is someone that the husband's cheating on. So some sort of outside person. And so rather than focus on the issues that they have, they start blaming this person that is outside the relationship. It can be a TV that distracts from the relationship between husband and wife, like shows. There's lots of ways that things can triangulate and deflect from the real issues between two people. So this is what we call triangulation, and um, happens a lot in relationships. If you've ever heard the phrase like having a baby to try to save the marriage, this was example of triangulation, and definitely don't recommend it. The next concept to talk about is differentiation and undifferentiation. Uh, so differentiation is our ability to differentiate between ourselves and others. So this would be this bullet point. And if we go back to this slide, this person is undifferentiated. They're just one and the same with some other person. They're enmeshed. Versus these people are maybe too differentiated. They're too separate. And so Bowen thought that we had to think about when people are overly differentiated or undifferentiated. And that would be like a fused self and others. And then he also was the first one to really think about how we can meld our thoughts and feelings together, where they're too fused, or they're too separate, where we don't really think about our feelings. So there's also this process of being too fused with our feelings and our thoughts, or they're not really connected. So it's a little bit like CBT, actually, probably a little precursor to CBT. But that's just another thing that he developed. This idea of differentiation can happen in different ways. And again, like I've mentioned before, these patterns get played along through generations. And it can really become difficult as generations go to break this cycle. And that's why people are suggested family therapy. One way that Bowen tries to get people to become a little bit more differentiated if they're fused, if let's say their thoughts and feelings are fused, is to de-emotionalize certain parts of a situation. So thinking through things on a cognitive level and then an emotional level, trying to get people to unfuse those two things and to think about it rationally and then think about it with their feelings. And oftentimes it's just too hard to separate. So there are different strategies and skills that focus on using this. And again, this is sort of a precursor almost to CBT. So eventually this led into the structural approach, which was developed by Salvador Minuchin. And this theory really builds on and expands on systems theory. So it's going to be very similar. It's just sort of a new development. And some of the primary concepts for the structural approach are delving more into the family structure. So really getting into what roles people are playing in the family. So maybe like a role that someone plays is the distant disciplinarian. I don't know if any of your families had this role, that someone in the family was a little bit more distant and involved in discipline. And then another person in the family, another parent, was maybe overly tender and permissive. So we have these roles that get developed, that become patterns, developed over time, and people sort of get into these different roles. And the structural approach will really start to examine these roles. Do we want to keep these roles? What way are these hurting us, that they're becoming really rigid roles? They'll often look at unspoken rules in families as well. So these were never like agreed upon when the family started or when people got married, but these just developed over time. So maybe let's say there's a couple that one person always ends up doing the dishes and the other person always ends up cooking. No one ever said that probably at the beginning, but it just developed over time that these people developed these rules and roles in the family. Maybe another rule is that the mom spends time with the children, and when the children act up, the father is the discipline. Maybe, let's say there's a family with two moms. Maybe mom one is the one who always plans the trip and is really organized, and the other mom is the quote fun mom or spontaneous mom, is less organized. And so there are these rules and roles that develop over time that, again, weren't really planned, but just sort of get rigid and can become problematic if they're too rigid. I'd encourage you to think about if there are any unspoken rules in your family and think about what some of those might be. For subsystems, again, I've mentioned this before, but there could be a child subsystem. It can be a parent subsystem. You can belong to multiple subsystems. So maybe it's the people who are really interested in football and the people who aren't have sort of subsystems, and that sort of melds or makes up your weekend plans. So structural approach will really examine these subsystems as well. And we'll look into these boundaries related to differentiation again. Rigid, diffuse, clear boundaries and mesh boundaries. That's all, again, sort of building off of systems theory. And therapists are often usually very active and directive in this type of theory. They're asking questions, they're telling you to do things. One of the things that they might do is a genogram, which is pictured up here. This is sort of like a family tree where you list, let's say there's a child M, the parents Bob and Amy, and then the black lines are just how they're related, but the red lines are the relationships. So M doesn't have a good relationship with Bob, his father, but M is very close to Amy. Amy and Bob seem to be doing okay. Amy and her mother Sally are fine, but Amy's father, Mike, has a bad relationship with Bob. They're estranged, so there's like maybe some tension there. And so there's all these different ways that you can plot out the family and sort of start to analyze what are the relationships between these systems. They might have people reenact certain key moments to try to really understand what's going on underneath the system. Just want to go back quickly to talk a little bit about differentiation a little bit more. So, with the levels of differentiation in structural approaches, again, there can be enmeshment or fusion where people want to be connected and they don't like being away from the other person. Um, there are very porous boundaries. I am you, you are me, we are me. They're very enmeshed. And sometimes this can cause anxiety, controlling behaviors, and so on. There's a disengagement where people feel apathetic. There's no real connection between two people in the family. There's sort of cold and distant relationships, but they're not very close. And then the healthy differentiation, which is sort of a mix of the two, where there's some empathy, you can have connection at times and separation at times. You can be close, you can be far, that you're individual people, but you can still come together for certain family functions. As a final moment, I want to go back to these unspoken rules that I mentioned. And I want you to think about, again, I asked you to think about what were some unspoken rules in your family. And I just have listed some that have come up in my own work with doing family therapy with clients. So sometimes an unspoken rule is we don't feel, we keep our emotions guarded, especially anger. And there's only one person in the family who can express that anger. Everyone else can't talk about their anger or their emotions. Another unspoken rule might be we're always in control. We don't show weakness. We don't ask for help because that's a sign of weakness. Maybe another unspoken rule is we don't want to pay attention to what's going on. We will ignore it, push it away, lying to ourselves and to others. Another unspoken rule might be we don't trust. We can't trust ourselves. We can't trust others. No one can be relied on and no one confided in. Our business stays in the family. We don't ever talk about what goes on in our family with anyone outside of it. And then final rule is maybe self-blame, that we are a bad family, we're to blame for everything bad that happens and we deserve it. They might not say that explicitly, but they're believing it. There's some unspoken message that that's um, in the family. So these are, again, the structural approaches, which really builds on systems theory. Um, for the next video, we'll talk about some classic family theory therapy approaches. So stay tuned.